Students, to another class of BA Part 2 English Literature. We will continue with Paper 1, Section A. Today's lecture is on another very popular romantic poet, that is Percy Bysshe Shelley, and we are going to study one of his very popular poems called The Ode to the West Wind. Percy Shelley was born on 4th of August 1792 and is one of the major English romantic poets besides what we have already studied, that is the poems of William Wordsworth and Coleridge. And Keats is also another very important romantic poet. And Shelley also was regarded as one of the greatest lyric and philosophical poets in the English language. Shelley, like other romantic poets, had been radical in his poetry as well as his political and social views, because he also was a product of the French Revolution. Shelley did not see fame during his lifetime, but because of his views and revolting ideals, but his recognition of his achievement in poetry grew steadily following his death. Shelley was also a key member of a close circle of visionary poets and writers that included Lord Byron, John Keats, Lehan, Thomas Love Peacock, and his own second wife, Mary Shelley, the writer of the Frankenstein. Some of the other important works of Shelley, besides Ode to the West Wind, are his very popular Ozymandias, To a Skylark, Music When Soft Voices Die, The Cloud and the Mask of Anarchy. And some other groundbreaking works are the Sensei, a verse drama published in 1819, a long visionary philosophical poem, Queen Mab, Alistair and the Revolt of Islam, Adonis, Prometheus Unbound. So these are some of his other important works which we need to know, so that along with the poem in the course, if we study other works of the writer, we get to know about the plethora of work created by that particular writer and his style of writing. So what is the genre of this poem, Ode to the West Wind? So as the title itself states, it's an ode. An ode is a lyrical stanza, a poem which has elaborately structured poem praising or glorifying an event or individual, describing the nature intellectually as well as emotionally. So Greek odes were originally poetic pieces performed with musical accompaniment, and as time passed on they gradually became known as personal lyrical compositions, whether sung or merely recited. So they have this musical quality, and so they were accompanied with some kind of an instrument. As with the ancient Greek odes, English odes of the 17th and 18th centuries were also occasionally set to music. So they have this kind of a rhythm and the meter. So continuing on the form of the poem, we find that the poem consists of 5 sections called cantos. The form of the poem is consistent in pattern because each stanza is of 14 lines in length, and they use the rhyming pattern of A, B, A. This is how the lines rhyme: B, C, B, C, D, C, D, E, D, and ending with the couplet E, E. And this kind of a rhyming pattern is called terza rima, which was used profusely by Dante in his Divine Comedy. So each section consists of 4 tercets: ABA, BCB, CDC, DED. 3 lines rhyming this way. And the couplet. The ode is written in iambic pentameter. So these are the facts which we need to know about the form of the poem. Coming to the structure of the poem, we find that we already know that it's consisting of 5 cantos. But how they are divided? They are divided because they can be broadly divided in 2 parts. The first three cantos are about the qualities of the west wind, and each ends with the invocation, O hear. The last two cantos give a relation between the wind and the speaker. The poem begins with three sections describing the wind's effects upon earth, air, and ocean. And in the last two sections, the poet speaks directly to the wind, asking for its power to lift him up and make him its companion in its wanderings. So, the poet has this romantic feeling for nature, where Shelley basically intellectualizes nature. Unlike Wordsworth, who spiritualizes, or Keats, who sees nature as it is. The poem ends with an optimistic note, which is that if winter days are here, then spring is not very far. So the poet also uh, adds a philosophical edge to the theme. The context of the poem. So, what was the background? That when Shelley uh, was in a forest near Florence, he was influenced by the atmosphere there, because the tempestuous wind at that time attracted his attention, and whose temperature is at once mild and animating. So he was enjoying this nature, and he was mesmerized by it, and thought of composing a poem on the wind which was blowing. And Shelley himself comments in his notes that, I quote, "As I foresaw at sunset, with a violent tempest of hail and rain, attended by that magnificent thunder and lightning peculiar to the Cisalpine regions." So, being in a particular area, he thought of this poem dedicating to the wind. So, what is the theme of the poem? We find that Shelley in this poem addresses the speaker, directly addresses the west wind. The speaker treats the west wind as a force of death and decay, and welcomes this death and decay because it means that only after this period of death or decay will rejuvenation and rebirth come. So it talks about the cyclic nature of all phenomena in nature. In the final two sections of the poem, the speaker suggests that he wants to help promote this rebirth through his own poetry. So, how he connects the phenomenon of nature with the phenomenon of his own poetry, and that rejuvenation he hopes to see is not only in his poetry or through his poetry, it is the political rejuvenation which he wants to see in his society, a rebirth of society and its ways of writing. So, social political message is also conveyed through this poem by Shelley. Coming to the figures of speech used in this poem, so we find that this is an ode which is rich in various kinds of figures of speech which you might have heard of. Some of them are very common, like the simile, which we have been studying since our childhood, where we compare two things which are different by using the words like or as. So here we find in the examples in the right that the poet calls the leaves that fall during the season of autumn are driven like ghosts. So the leaves are compared to the ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. So the west wind is like an enchanter, a witch, which drives away the leaves like the ghosts, and each like a corpse within its grave. So this is here, the seeds are compared to the dead body or the corpse within its grave. So as we read the poem, we find that there are so many similes when we read the poem in detail. Sweet buds are compared to flocks to feed in air, loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves, and so on and so forth. Another important figure of speech used in the poem is a metaphor, where again we compare two things, but we attribute a figure of speech in which a word or a phrase literally denoting one kind of object or idea in place of another, and there is a suggestive analogy. For instance, the wind is called the breath of autumn's being, or the angels of rain and lightning. So these are some of the examples of the simile and metaphor. Few more are the personification, symbol, and alliteration, which also abound in this poem. And personification is an attribution of a personal nature or human characteristic to something non human, or the representation of an abstract quality in human form. So, the poet addressing the west wind in the way as if it was a human being, when the poet calls it the breath of autumn's being. So the word thou, that means you, from whose unseen presence the leaves dead. So these are all ways of addressing the west wind as if it were a person. Now, symbol is another figure of speech used in the poem profusely, and a symbol is a mark or character used as a conventional representation of an object, function, or process. So, mostly all poems are symbolic in nature, but we find that Shelley's West Wind has many deep symbols, where the west wind is a symbol both of a destroyer as well as a preserver in the various ways we will study in the poem. And it is also the uh, dirge of the dying year, west wind, denoting both death and rebirth, power of nature. So these are the various symbols which are connoted to the wind and the other features in the poem. And we also find that the poem also uses alliteration, where there is the repetition of the same letter or sound at the beginning of adjacent or closely connected words. For instance, in the title or the first line itself, "O wild west wind," or another line, "Grow grey with fear." So we find these sounds or the letters repeating themselves, giving it a rhythm and a music. So these are the various figures of speech used in the poem, and you'll find many more as we keep studying the each canto in our next lecture. So with this, we come to end of part 1 of Shelley's very famous Ode to the West Wind. Thank you so much.